we are going to talk about these new
Mm,
documents. I don't know anything about them, which I think is good because you will obviously be able to
right.
um, give us give us a kind of it's a genuine conversation, which I think helps. Um, so you've been spending a bit of time, Ben, looking through these new documents. What is the standout thing?
Well, it's the final word really on MI5's investigation of Kim Philby, the most important double agent in history, arguably. Certainly the most important in British history. Philby was an MI6 officer who had been recruited by the communist Soviet intelligence service in the 1930s, and he worked his way through British intelligence, rising up through the ranks of MI6. But throughout that time, he was betraying every secret he could lay his hands on to the Russians, with
Hmm.
murderous results. I mean, many people died as a result. But Philby came under investigation for various reasons, and although he spied for the Soviets for 3 decades, he was not caught, he was not trapped until 1963. And I think the most fascinating thing, there are 21 MI5 files released in this latest declassification. It's the largest declassification I've ever seen. It's huge. And it's really the final word from MI5, which is our security service, importantly. That's the internal security service, it's counter espionage. It's not MI6, which is foreign intelligence, which is what Philby was
Hmm.
involved in. So this is the internal investigation into what Philby was really up to. And it gives you absolute chapter and verse on what was going on, including a certain amount of slip up by MI5, the kind of extremely cool way in which Philby batted away the various allegations that were made against him. And then, crucially, in 1963, when he was finally exposed, when a friend from the 1930s came forward, it's never been quite explained why it took so long for her to come forward, came forward and said that Philby had tried to recruit her as a Soviet spy in the 30s. That unraveled Philby, who by this point was in Beirut working as a journalist. And his closest friend in MI6, a man called Nicholas Elliott, who'd been his friend for decades. His
Hmm.
closest collaborator, Elliot, had always defended him against these charges, was sent out to Beirut to confront him, to try to out him, to try and get
Gosh.
him to confess. And
Hmm.
what this file contains, and I've never seen it before, is a transcript of the conversation that they had because Elliot secretly recorded it in a safe house in Beirut. And it's I mean, if you're keen on spycraft, it's absolutely thrilling stuff because it sounds like two old friends having a drink and chatting about old times. In fact, it's a brutal fist fight to the death, really, because the stakes are that high. So anyway, it's a fascinating story, I think,
It,
because
is there a moment though where he kind of concedes and confesses and says, actually, yes.
well, he says he's confessing. Elliot offers him immunity from prosecution. Now,
Mm,
Elliot had no legal basis for doing that. He was clearly, I think it was a ruse to get him to talk. Philby said,
mm,
"Well, old chap, I mean, because we're friends, I'll tell you everything. Here's the scoop," he says. What he produces is both a written and a conversational half confession. Some of it is true, much of it is deliberately vague, and a lot of it is lies. I mean, a lot of it is completely untrue. It's Philby's
mm,
way of holding Elliot off long enough so that he can escape, and that is what duly happens. Because a few days after this confrontation, with Elliot apparently believing that he's got the truth out of Philby, Philby vanishes. He's supposed to go to a dinner party. He doesn't turn up at the dinner party in Beirut. He climbs onto a Soviet ship that is waiting in Beirut harbor, and he flees to Russia. And he stays there for the next 28 years. So this is the key moment. And what I love about it is it's still not clear, even though all this stuff has been released, whether Elliot, this very clever MI6 officer, was
mm,
being taken for a ride, or whether he actually wanted Philby to escape to avoid the embarrassment of a prosecution and an investigation, whether he deliberately left the door open. You can read this
mm.
confession in two different ways.
And do the documents cast any more light? I know this has been discussed for for decades about how Kim Philby was able to get away with his deception for so long. I mean, was it the age old kind of? It was a bit of both. He was a brilliant spy, and the security services missed what was in front of their noses, or does this add anything extra?
It adds a huge amount, really. I mean, it confirms that really Philby's escape from prosecution was because he belonged to the club. He belonged to an upper middle class, educated, old school boy world where
Mm.
MI6 in particular, but also people in MI5, simply couldn't believe that somebody with the right accent, the
Like
right
that, yeah.
pedigree, the right education, he belonged to all the right clubs, could possibly be a Soviet spy. So it
Mm.
reconfirms all of that. But let me give you just one example of one of the things that crops up in here, which is what Graham Greene referred to as the splinter of ice in Philby's soul. So very early on in the war, a Russian KGB officer called Konstantin Volkov turned up in Istanbul and offered to hand over to MI6 a vast trove of intelligence, which would have actually probably half destroyed the KGB. He included in this tantalizing hints that there were 9 individuals in British senior positions in the British establishment, including 2 in British intelligence who were actually KGB spies. And he identified one of them as being head of a counterintelligence section. Now, at this point, Philby had risen in MI6 to become head of the Soviet counterintelligence section. It was clearly a reference to him. So
Mm.
Volkov's offer was sent back to London. Philby took one look at it and realized that he was in deep trouble, alerted the KGB, took over the case himself, and flew to Istanbul. Now, by the time he got to Turkey, Volkov and his wife had been kidnapped by KGB thugs, injected with soporific drugs, tied in bandages, loaded onto a plane, and flown to Moscow, where they were murdered. So Philby managed to avert not only his own
Wow,
exposure, but what would have
gosh.
been a Cold War changing dump of intelligence to the West. So that's just one example of the way Philby, for all his charm and all his education and his
Mm.
convivial manner, was a murderous brute in the end. He was prepared to kill to save his own skin. And he did it
It's
countless
really
times.
yeah, and it's so chilling. Again, we know this stuff, but to hear it yet again relayed is chilling stuff. Do any of these documents give any more information or explanation for why he did this? Because um, was it money? Was it power? What was it? Because, as you said earlier, this was someone who had access to everything, who was the right sort of person in inverted commas. Why did he need to do
Why
this?
did he do it? Well, yes, it provides fascinating insight into his own psychology, but you have to filter it through Philby's own explanations, which are extremely misleading. Philby
Mm,
maintains, well, one of the things that he lied to Elliot about was he said, "Oh, I gave up spying for the Russians in 1946." Well, he didn't. He kept going for another 2 decades. I mean,
yeah.
that was a total lie. He maintained, "Oh, I was a useful communist, but by the 1940s, it was quite clear that the Britain was going the right direction, so I decided to give it up." That wasn't true either. Philby was motivated initially by communist ideology. He really was. I mean, there's no doubt that when he was 18 at Cambridge, as many people did, he became a real devotee of that ideology. But as time goes on, it's quite clear that he's doing it for other reasons. He's doing it for the adventure. He's doing it for that very seductive feeling of knowing more than the person standing next to you. He's an extraordinarily
Wow.
arrogant person, Philby, and he loved the idea of knowing a bit more. He certainly didn't do it for money. I mean, that is quite clear from these files. At one point, he said, "I never," and this is true. He never took any money from the Soviets, although they did once buy him a suit from Austin Reed because they felt that he didn't look smart enough for his
Good grief.
meetings with British intelligence. So, but no, he did. He wasn't motivated by money, but he also wasn't motivated purely by ideology. He was. You can tell from these files, and he still is trying to pull the wool over MI6's eyes right to
Mm,
the end. He thinks he's in control, but Philby himself never knew really whether he had been allowed to escape or even forced to escape or whether he had done so out of his own volition. He wrote to Elliot after he'd got to Moscow saying, I never knew whether you wanted me to do a fade. Now, a fade is intelligence jargon for a defection. So even Philby was unclear about whether Elliot had really pulled one over on him in the final exchange. And we'll probably never know. I mean, this is the biggest release of any intelligence about Philby there has ever been, and even that doesn't answer the question, the final mystery of did he jump or was he pushed? And we'll never know, I think, because Elliot, I think, took that secret to the grave with him in 1994.
Absolutely fascinating. Goodness me, Ben, thank you so much. You've spurred me on to read even more about Kim Philby. Absolutely fascinating. I love it. Thank you so much for your time.